My view is that if you want your ideas, your policies, your worldview to be as robust as possible, the best thing you can do is talk to and have conversations with people that you fundamentally disagree with. Now, in Britain, there's one problem with that for people on the left, and that is conservatives here, they're just not very interesting. They don't say very original, intelligent, informed things. There are a few exceptions, one of which is Peter Hitchens. Peter has been a correspondent with regards to trade unions. He was in Moscow for the collapse of the Soviet Union. He went to Washington. He's been an opinion writer with the Mail on Sunday for the best part of 20 years. He's written books on the abolition of Britain, so-called, the phony victory, and how the myth of the Second World War isn't all what it seems, and on hugely controversial subjects such as education, capital punishment, and divorce. Now, it's important to say we didn't agree about a great deal during this interview, but I still think it's hugely useful. The reason being that he tests the arguments and perspectives on the left relatively strongly, and you have to make your arguments, and by doing so, you refine them and make them all the stronger. So I hope you enjoy the interview. Peter Hitchens, welcome to NGUYью Media.
It's a pleasure so far.
How are you doing? How do we find you on this rather grim January afternoon?
So far, so good. I'm living in extra time anyway, so I take every day as joy.
It's a good attitude. I'm going to start with a bit of I suppose, an esoteric question. You are something of a sort of go-to voice, it seems, for people like Owen Jones. We have you here on NGUYью Media. We're quite interested in what you have to say. As a conservative, you often speak to Joe Media. Why do you think you occupy this almost unique niche of being somebody from the right who the left is quite interested in talking to?
Must be because I'm so nice.
Any other reasons?
I can't think of any other reason. Sure, that's enough.
But there's lots of nice people in the media, aren't there? There's lots of overly, dangerously nice people in the media.
Well, you've got to watch out for the dangerously nice ones.
So you think you're just...
They may not be as nice as they seem.
I don't know, I entirely agree.
That must be it. I can't think of any other explanation, can you?
You were Trotskyist for quite a long time, weren't you? 7 years?
I joined what was then the International Socialist, I am sure of this, in 1968. And I left by sending a letter of resignation to the journalism fraction in 1975. So yeah, seven years of that, and then some time of sort of drifting.
Is there anything that you learned during that period from the Marxist tradition which you still kind of agree with? Perspectives or particular theories?
Look, I've never disagreed with the fundamental point that one seeks in life to improve the lot of other people. And that's what we most deeply set out to do. That was the driving force beneath it. The reason why I abandoned it was because it obviously wasn't going to achieve that.
But that's a renunciation perhaps of the organisation more than the ideology.
No, it isn't. It's a renunciation of the ideology.
So explain to me, what does that look like between 68 and 75? You embrace an ideology and then you recognise it no longer works. What was the catalyst?
First of all, the form that the Trotskyism took when I joined was very much an attempt to turn the working class into a revolutionary force through the actions of some sort of vanguard party. And at the time, there was an awful lot of industrial trouble. It makes today's look tiny. And we got the impression that we might actually have some influence. I spent a lot of time when I was a Trotskyist talking to and running discussion groups of, in Oxford, dustmen from the council refuse depot, in Scarborough, a group of workers at a coach building factory up there. The Oxford International Socialists had quite good contacts within some parts of the car plants there. We were students, most of us, and we had all the defects of students, but we were tempered and educated by the fact that we also had quite intense contacts with the people we thought were going to change the world. And it seemed real at the time. It really did. And it was only when I went to work on my own account to earn my own wage and to set out on my own career that I began to see that this was a fantasy.
What of it was a fantasy? Because
the world wasn't as we imagined. I assumed, apart from anything else, a level of what you might call class consciousness among the rulers of the country that they didn't have. I assumed forms of malice and a desire to repress and a hostility towards liberty, which didn't exist. I had to spend a lot of time when I first went to work for the Swindon Evening Advertiser talking to police officers, firemen, going and reporting on flower shows and talking to people on their golden weddings. And I couldn't live any longer in the curious sort of spaceship which the University of York had been, where for the previous 3 years, I was forced into the company of normal human beings. And it was plain to me, first of all, that normal human beings, even if they were Tory councillors, didn't possess the malicious and repressive instincts I'd attributed to them. And it was also obvious to me that revolutionaries were, and I was reading a lot of Arthur Koestler at the time, that revolutionaries were often people who set out to reform the world, but would have been better occupied reforming themselves. It was a point he made. It's a particular novel of his, a minor novel, largely forgotten now, called Arrival and Departure, in which this point is very strongly made. And I read it about that time, and I thought, yes, there is a lot to this. So two forces. One, the feeling that the revolutionary impulse was fundamentally ridiculous and reflected an inadequacy in myself. And secondly, the feeling that the world was not as I believed it to be.
So that's the Trotskyist element, but I wonder more the Marxist element. So, for instance...
Are they separate?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, there are many. Well, look at Stalin, for one, would have said as much.
Well, I think they both have accepted some sort of common root in Marxism.
Sure, but I mean, Trotskyism is a particular revolutionary theory of change, and obviously it's an outgrowth of Marxism. But I suppose there are people that work in the City of London who are relatively familiar with the works of Marx, and they might read political economists from the Marxist tradition, and they make their decisions in terms of market trading on sort of Marxist precepts. So I wonder, is there anything that you still sort of learnt from that, like the Labour theory of value, historical materialism?
It seemed to me, from what I could gather, I'm not an economist, but it seemed to me what I gather of it, that much of what Marx has said about economics and things such as the Labour theory of value had been shown to be pretty much invalid. And the theory of immiseration, I think it was, where inevitably capitalism would force the living standards of the proletariat downwards and downwards, had been demonstrably shown to be false during the almost all of the 20th century. It wasn't true. That didn't work. But that didn't matter, because what we really were, we were Leninists. We thought that political power could still be used to create a more equal, fair, just society, a utopia, and that the mistakes of the Russian Revolution had been avoidable mistakes, which Trotsky represented a denunciation of those mistakes and a different path. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, now is complete self-deluding falsehood, but it's what I thought at the time.
So for instance, a Marxist would say, 2007 crisis happens. I think a Marxist, or a Keynesian for that matter, would have a particular perspective on that crisis, and actually those kinds of people, looking back at them now, had the best read on what would happen over the preceding 15 years. They would have said, the growth model we just have relied on for 20 years has disappeared. We're going to need a new growth model, and we're looking at basically stagnating living standards and wages interminably until we arrive at a new growth model. So a Marxist would have arrived at that kind of conclusion, whereas a sort of a regular liberal economist said, don't worry, almost as a act of faith, there'll be some more growth next year.
Surely there are non-Marxist economists who've managed to reach intelligent conclusions.
Of course there are.
These things. Marxism has no exclusive handle on being critical of the way the system works, or a warning against the sort of things that can and do go wrong with it.
But I mean,
so it's not. It doesn't. If it doesn't have that exclusive handle, then why bother with the rest of the whole removal van of stuff which comes with it that you have to take on if you subscribe to Marxism? There are other non-Marxist people who can offer a perfectly intelligent critique of the operation of capitalism, which doesn't require the creation of an insane, blood-stained utopia to deal with it.
So my read on this is, for instance, even Marx, when he writes Capital, he's taking ideas from Ricardo, from Smith, and so it seems strange to me to not be able to do the same thing with Marx, say, or with any intellectual figure, quite frankly. okay, this makes sense. Oh, this is clearly something which was something of an intellectual discovery, which led to subsequent discoveries, which actually illuminate certain problems in society.
People can make discoveries, which are discoveries of intelligence and research and clear thought, which don't necessarily represent a triumph for the ideology they happen to have embraced. That's the only point I'm making here. I was brought up in the 1950s, though really in the 1930s, for a world that didn't exist anymore. That came to an end. I witnessed, as an inquisitive child and early teenager, the collapse of the old establishment amid the satire boom and the aftermath of Suez and the Parfumé affair. You couldn't believe any more in what I had been brought up to believe in after that. And I searched for something else. I found revolutionary socialism. I found that unsatisfactory, but it gave me a very useful training in real hard politics, realistic politics, not the soppy or public relations sort which so many people encounter. And it wasn't a career, and I left it. And since then, there's been a great hole in my life left by the absence of an ideology, which I seek to fill, fairly unsuccessfly.
To this day, you're seeking to fill. You're still an ideological traveller.
Once your life has been driven by a really seriously thought out worldview, if you lose that worldview, then there is something missing, in which you, in my case certainly, you feel the need to replace. And it's extraordinary how it was almost mystical, the belief that I had in the force, power, and necessity of the socialist revolution when I was doing that.
But aren't there millions of people like that? So people that grew up in the 50s. I mean, my mother was born, she's now passed away. She was born in 1955. She was raised in Aldershot. So
yeah, I know what you mean.
You know, her mother married a different chap, and so she was raised effectively in a sort of, not military family, but you know, her father wasn't in the military, but that was the world that she was raised in, still very much an imperial power. She would say things to me, even when I was growing up in the 1980s, which were clearly an afterthought or almost an echo of the 50s. You know, say quite socially conservative things, which in the 2020s you no longer hear. But there are millions of people like that, aren't there, that lived through those experiences and maybe dallied with various ideologies.
They're not in the trade of journalism in that case. They're elsewhere. Perhaps it's simply that I'm one of the few who came into this trade. I'm an unlikely journalist. I wanted to be a destroyer captain when I was a child. Journalism came as very much a second choice, and something which I did with some trepidation and reluctance, and in many cases I wasn't very good at it. And my first few years in Fleet Street were a series of humiliations and setbacks, which it still makes me wince to think of. But on the other hand, it had compensations when I eventually got to the point where I was able to write what I really wanted to do, which was the sort of commentary and opinion writing, which informed by reporting, which is what I do now. Then that was so immensely satisfying that it makes all the setbacks of the past seem trivial, but they were definitely there.